15, Clause 5 will stand part. The question now is that Clause 6 stand part. Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, I rise to take a short call on Clause 6 of the 25 or 30 minutes short call on the International Financial Agreements Bill. Labor supports the bill, and in particular it supports this clause, which brings into effect the amendments to the schedule proposed in 2010 on Schedule 1, Ms Dalzell, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, that is. Now, the important matters here, let me first put in context by rephrasing the role of the IMF. The international financial institutions, Mr Chairman, are structured around the following general roles. The World Bank is tasked primarily with providing development advice and some co-funding to important development projects. The International Monetary Fund is tasked with providing backup financial resources to assist developing and emerging economies and to help to underpin the stability of the international financial system. Its developed member countries provide special drawing rights as liabilities against each country's national accounts, and in New Zealand's case those liabilities add up to something over $1 billion. Earlier in this debate we had debate over the one clause of this bill that Labor opposes, which was the removal of the right to parliamentary scrutiny in Clause 4. Labor proposed an amendment to that which was defeated, and the bill has carried that clause. Nonetheless, because the IMF board has already agreed and ratified the changes here, Labor believes it's important that this Parliament play its part by sealing that within New Zealand law, by passing this bill and thereby enacting the measures, the amendments to the articles of the IMF that are contained in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Schedule 2 amends Schedule 1 implementing the 2010 reforms. And in particular, I'd like to draw the House's attention to Article 12, Sections 3B and D, which reaffirms firstly in B that the Executive Board consists of 20 Executive Directors elected by the members and the Managing Director as Chairman. That for the purpose of each regular election of Executive Directors, the Board of Governors, by an 85% majority of the total voting power, may increase or decrease the number of the Executive Directors. Now, 85 is a very important number, Mr Chairman, because one country, the United States, holds 16% of the voting power. And the astute, like Andrew Williams MP, will note that 85 plus 16 is 101. Thus, the United States has an effective veto over the enlargement or contraction of the voting board. Now, that's been historically justified in terms of its preeminent role in funding the IMF. It's, of course, based in Washington, D.C. It was part of the post-war UN and global institutional reconstruction. But nonetheless, others would say that it has conferred upon the United States a very important tool of influence and leverage on the international economy. And that is reflected in Article 12D and C, which in a sense entrench the current United States veto over the composition of the board. Now, the IMF is going through several very important transitions. In an earlier contribution in the committee stage of this debate, I noted the shift in thinking which has gone on at the IMF. It's been led by the current and previous Secretary Generals, Christine Lagarde and Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and it's been embodied in particular in the writing of the chief economist of the IMF, the renowned Olivier Blanchard. And he has led quite an effort in revisionist economic thinking, which, for example, has contradicted earlier IMF doctrine that running budget surpluses leads you to the best of all possible worlds. Recent work by the IMF has reaffirmed the importance of the government spending multiplier and warned governments around the world that excessive austerity, when they are recovering from a global financial crisis, might be the worst thing that they could do. That's a pretty important shift for the IMF. But there's another shift that's going on that is directly related to Schedule 2, and that is a shift in the membership and the relative voting weights, contributions, potential contributions of members, and it really relates to the shift in geopolitical power, to the rise of South and East Asia, the rise of China and India and the nations of Southeast Asia. Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Just warming up, Mr. Chairman, just warming up. Another 15 minutes to go.
The first of many.
That's right. That's right. Mr. Chairman, the rise of economic power in East and South Asia has had the impact of, some would argue, restoring the globe to its historical, long-run historical shares of global GDP, where East and South Asia took about a quarter each. Europe took about a quarter, and the New World, so-called, took about a quarter. Of course, in the early part of the century, that's not been the case, and the trends are now being reflected in discussions at the IMF board level about voting rights and membership. And in that respect, it is very interesting that these articles reaffirm the veto power of the United States over the expansion or contraction of the board and thereby decision-making rights. One could argue that there is a little bit of tension between the article that we are passing now, which is entrenching the historical preeminence of the United States and its power over the IMF, and the global megatrend, which is seeing the rise of East and South Asia, and potentially, China's already the world's second biggest economy, its relevant influence over the global economic institutions. And that is a drama, sir, which will no doubt play out over the next decade or so as the world enters a very interesting time in the shift of the balance of global strategic power towards the east. But moving on, sir, to section 3, we're repealing and substituting various entitlements of executive directors to cast vote, whether they should be cast as units or individually, the ability to substitute executive directors for alternates, and the various abilities to appoint or not appoint an executive director. And if we move on to Schedule D, we go further into the ability to cast as alternates, and Schedule E, transitional provisions in respect to the change of executive directors. In short, sir, the 2010 reforms are all about fine-tuning the rights and responsibilities of the executive directors of the board. Now, whether New Zealand assents in its parliament or not, those matters will pass into global practice because they've already been ratified by the IMF. Labor has got some mixed feelings about it. We support the bill, we support the clause, but we recognise that the IMF will need to continue to modernise if it has continued to be relevant to the most important debates in the global economy, that its internal power structure, the structure of its board, will need to adapt over time to bring the rising powers of Asia more to the centre of global institutional decision-making, because that is in the interests of all of us. We want the rising powers of Asia to feel that they have a good seat at the table. We want them to feel that they are actively participating, that they have skin in the global economic game rather than standing outside it. That will mean that they have an incentive to play by global trade and macroeconomic rules, that we will get past the relatively sterile debate about the artificial lowering of Chinese exchange rates and the accumulation of trade surpluses, because a lot of those debates will be held around the table of the economic institutions that matter. And so Labor believes it's important that while we support this bill to ratify and recognise our role as a participant in the IMF, that our executive director continues to urge the IMF, or our region's executive directors continue to urge the IMF to move in the direction of modernisation. Mr. Speaker, that is part of several important trends that are going on within this institution that are making it more relevant to the modern world. As I said before, the evolution in macroeconomic thinking away from the old Washington consensus, the old neoliberal orthodoxy, and towards a more multifaceted, broad-based approach to economics that takes on board the impact of behavioural economics, that looks at the global financial crisis and its aftermath, that has a multi-tool, multi-target approach to monetary policy, that rejects extreme austerity in favour of a more balanced fiscal approach. Those are all the hallmarks of an institution that is in a very important transition, and a world that is in an important transition to a new era of economic management.
The question is,
Booby Prize.
are you seeking a call?
I am. That's why I stood up and said, Mr. Chairman.
I didn't hear the Mr. Chairman.
He is a quiet young man.
Must have been very dulcet, so I'll accept the member said it.